Hello everyone, I'm Charlotte and I work at NHSN and I'm also a full-time bee enthusiast. So in this talk I'm going to share with you some of my urban bee encounters and what bee species you can find in your local area throughout the year. So I live in Gateshead, just south of Newcastle, and for the past couple of years I've really tried to explore more of my local area and try to record as many insects and plants as possible. So I've tried to make my garden more bee friendly, but also looking at my local parks more and exploring new areas such as my local industrial estate and new footpaths and cycleways in search of bees. And here are some of the bees that I've observed this year. So just on these 12 bee species, you can really see the diversity of bees, not just in their appearance, but they also are really diverse in their nesting habits, as well as their feeding habits as well. And they are also different in when they fly throughout the year. So there's a really nice sequence of bees that you can observe in your local area. So really kicking off the bee season are the queen bumblebees. So these bees have spent much of the winter underground hibernating. And when it starts to get milder at the start of the year, you will start to see queen bumblebees about. They are big, they are burly, and they are quite loud. And you can expect to see at least 7 or 8 common bumblebee species in your local area. And on here I have 4 of these common species. So at the top left here we have the tree bumblebee, which is actually quite a recent arrival to the northeast. It was first recorded in Northumberland in 2007. We also have the early bumblebee at the top right. As the name suggests, it's out early in the year, but its nests also end quite early in the season as well. We've got the red-tailed bumblebee at the bottom right and the buff-tailed bumblebee at the bottom left, which is one of the first bumblebee species you're likely to see in the year. And at this time of year, the queen bumblebees are fueling up after spending quite some time underground hibernating. And once they are fueled up, they are on the search for a suitable nest site. For most bumblebee species, that's underground, so old rodent burrows, but they can also be found under sheds and compost heaps. And the tree bumblebee likes to nest high up, so it's often found nesting in old bird boxes and also roof eaves as well. And it's a really lovely time of year once you start to see the bumblebees, because you know that the warmer seasons are soon to arrive. Not long after you see the queen bumblebees, you'll also see some of the early rising solitary bees. So unlike bumblebees and honeybees, solitary bees nest alone. So one nest is the result of one female. There are no worker bees like that inside bumblebee and honeybee nests. And one of the first solitary bees you're very likely to see are the tawny mining bees. So you can see on the left hand side image there that they are really stunning bees, and the females have this foxy coloured fur, really dense fur, and really hairy black legs as well. And they are a type of mining bee. So the females dig into the ground to build their nest burrows. Inside these burrows are her eggs, as well as nectar and pollen that she's collected. And they are a species that likes to nest in short grass, for example, lawns, and also bare ground as well. And on the bottom right image there, you can see a little nest site of tawny mining bees. And around each entrance is a lot of soil. And that's the result of the female digging up all this material. So they can dig quite a lot of material for what are relatively small creatures. And so if you see these sort of volcano-like mounds around little holes, you very likely have some sort of mining bee nest in there. And there was quite a sizable population of these bees at my local park this year. I counted at least 40 holes, so there was at least 40 mining bees nesting there, which is pretty exciting. And alongside the tawny mining bees, I also found a new species for my park, which is the Clark's mining bee. And this is quite a nice bee because it's very specialist. So the females will actually only collect pollen from willow trees. They will collect nectar from different plants, but they are really dependent on willow for their source of pollen. And it was really nice to see a specialist bee in my local park. And I actually wasn't really aware that there was willow trees at my local park, which I later discovered. So it was really nice to see this bee, and it was nesting alongside the tawny mining bees. And there was a couple of other species there as well, the buffish mining bee, for example. So while they are solitary bees, they will nest close together in suitable sites. Another mining bee that you're likely to find in your urban area are the chocolate mining bees. So unfortunately, they don't mine chocolate for us, but rather the name is referring to the colour of their fur. But unlike other mining bees, I've mainly found this species nesting in walls. So on the top right image there, you can see this stone wall. And this is along a busy road not too far from my house. And there was quite a sizable population of these bees nesting in the crevices of this wall, which was really nice to see. And on the opposite side of the road, they were also nesting in the pavement cracks along the footpath. And so you sort of had to hopscotch your way through that bit because there was quite a few holes there with flying bees. So again, a really nice bee to find in your urban area. And they are quite unusual because although they are solitary bees, they will often share the same communal nest entrance, which will lead to their own individual burrows. And when you have a good population of mining bees, you will also likely find their cuckoos. So cuckoo bees basically exploit the hard work of their hosts because they sneak into a nest and lay their own eggs inside, and their offspring will feed on the food stores that the host species has provided. And this particular cuckoo bee here is one of the nomad bees. So nomad bees attack the nests of mining bees, and this nomad bee in particular is the Martian's nomad bee, which lays its eggs inside the nests of chocolate mining bees. So I saw quite a number of these nomad bees at the nesting site of the wall that I just showed you beforehand. And these bees don't look very much like typical bees at all. You can see it looks quite wasp-like and it hasn't got a lot of hair. And that's because cuckoo bees don't need to worry about picking up pollen because they don't collect any pollen or nectar for their offspring. And you'll often find these cuckoo bees scheming around nest sites, waiting for their host species to leave so that they can sneak into a nest and lay their own eggs inside. So it's quite a fascinating life cycle. So moving on to the mason bees, you are very likely to find red mason bees in your local area. So unlike most mining bees, these mason bees tend to nest in aerial locations, for example, walls, dead wood, or bee hotels. And I had a little male red mason bee spending the night in a wall plug in my garden, and it stayed there for about a week. So every morning I would go out and see his little face popping out of the wall plug, and he'd sort of wait there until the temperature warmed up, and he'd go out and about doing his business trying to find a female to mate with. But it was a really nice sighting to have in the garden. And I was also really excited to have nesting red mason bees in my garden. So on the top left there, you can see a female, and at the bottom left, is her nest. This is looking inside my bee hotel. And you can see that she has collected nectar and pollen, which is this yellow substance here. She'll lay her egg and then she'll seal off each egg with a mud wall. So you can see that she's got this these facial horns on her face. And she'll go out and collect wet mud using her jaws, but once she's back at her nest, she will then use these facial horns to mould the wet mud into place to create these little walls. And she filled up at least 4 of these rows of my bee hotel, which I totted up to be around 40 little cocoons. So hopefully I'll have all 40 red mason bees emerging next year, which will be brilliant. And while they aren't technically bees, I do have to mention the Bayflies, who are also out and about early in the year. They are fantastic bee mimics. They are these furry flies with a ridiculous narwhal tusk-like proboscis, which they use to extract nectar from flowers. But they don't just mimic bees, they actually depend on bees to survive and reproduce. So the females actually flick their eggs towards the burrows of mining bees, and the larvae will actually feed on the food stores that the bees have provided for their own offspring. And the picture on the left here is from a very windy, cold day in March, and there was lots of bee flies on the footpath, on a busy footpath, looking very sorry for themselves. So I spent my lunch break picking them up and putting them elsewhere, away from any footsteps and away from the awful wind. I think they were very happy to get some warmth from my hand as well. And the females have a very clever trick up their sleeve to ensure that their offspring survive. So I observed this female at my local park, rubbing basically her bottom against this bare soil patch. And what she's actually doing is coating her eggs in soil. And once she's coated her eggs in soil, she'll then flick her eggs towards the burrows of mining bees. And this is believed to prevent desiccation, so preventing her eggs from drying out, which is particularly important because they are quite exposed. And then her larvae will then find a little mining bee burrow to then feed on the food stores. So a really fascinating life cycle and bizarre. But it was really nice to see this behaviour up close and in my local park. So once queen bumblebees have found a suitable place to nest, they will start to lay eggs, which will turn into worker bumblebees. And you can start to see worker bumblebees from around April, May time, depending on the season, right the way through until September time. And they are basically smaller versions of queen bumblebees, but they can be quite variable. And the sole purpose of the worker bumblebees is to go out and collect nectar and pollen for their developing siblings back at the nest. So they really are quite busy bees and very hard working as well. I believe that they can carry up to 70% of their own weight in nectar and pollen, showing just how hard working they are. But yeah, it's really lovely to see them. And yeah, you can see them from April through to September time, possibly even October if it's particularly mild. Once the spring bee activity has died down a bit, you start to see new bees on the block, and most notably for me are the leafcutter bees. These are fantastic solitary bees that, as their name suggests, collect sections of leaves in order to line their nests. And you can see on the right hand image here, they've got this really large wedge-shaped jaws that they use basically as scissors to snip off sections of leaf. So you seem to be particularly fond of garden rose leaves, So if you have any garden roses and you see these sort of semicircular holes cut out of your leaves, you very likely had some leafcutter bee visitors. At the top left here are the leaves of snowberry. So there was quite a lot of bitten leaves, which was nice to see. But in my garden, I had some little willow herbs growing up through the gravel. And there was this one patchwork leafcutter bee who was snipping off sections of leaf from the willow herbs. And it was really interesting watching her because she would sort of scan the leaves, and she was very selective with like what leaf she wanted to snip sections from. So I'm really intrigued as to what she was sort of looking for when she was snipping these leaves. But it was really nice to observe this behaviour and also watch her flying away with a massive leaf section underneath her. And she's also quite interesting because, unlike most bees, leafcutter bees collect pollen using a pollen brush on their underside, and mason bees do the same as well. You also see some smaller bees in urban areas that are so easily overlooked because they are tiny. And one of these smaller bees are the yellow-faced bees. So these aren't very hairy at all. People can confuse them as maybe little wasps or flies. And they are so called because they have yellow or creamy markings on their face. And in the males, this can often be sort of a mask that you can see on the right-hand image here. And they aren't very hairy, and that's because they don't collect pollen on their legs or on the underside of their abdomen. They actually swallow the pollen to then later regurgitate back at the nest. They don't need a lot of hair because they don't need to pick up any pollen. So they are quite primitive in their behaviour compared to the other bees that we see. And on the left here is one of the yellow-faced bees that I found in my industrial estate. So this is quite a specialist bee because it likes to collect pollen from mignonette or also weld, which is a similar species. And this was outside an abandoned business plot where they allowed the plants to grow up up through the cracks of the pavement. And there was a little population of these bees foraging on this particular patch, and they were nesting in the nearby wall. It's really lovely to see, and this was a new species for me. On the right hand side we have the hairy-faced yellow-faced bee, and that's because they have a little hairy face. And it was lovely to see this bee in my garden, and you really have to take a photo of them up close to really appreciate them because they are really tiny bees. But amazing that they share our urban green spaces with us. And I was also really excited to find one nesting in my bee hotel. So here you can see a female yellow-faced bee, and she's collected a liquidy mix of pollen and nectar, and she's then sealed this off with a cellophane-like material that she's secreted from her body, and that protects her eggs against any intruders or dampness or fungi and anything like that. And she'll continue this process until her little burrow is full up. So it's really nice to see this behaviour up close. So as I mentioned earlier, we have cuckoo bees that attack solitary bees, but we also have cuckoo bumblebees that take over the nests of other bumblebee species. So on the left here we have the red-tailed cuckoo bee that attacks the red-tailed bumblebee, and on the bottom right we have Barbett's cuckoo bee, which attacks the nests of garden bumblebee. And they look very similar to their host, and they are really clever because they do emerge a bit later than queen bumblebees, and that's so that when they emerge they have a nest to take over, but they don't want to emerge too late because they don't want a big bumblebee nest that could cause them to admit defeat, because what they do is they sneak into a nest of a bumblebee, they will kill the queen, and lay their own eggs inside, and the existing worker bees will be fooled into looking after her own eggs. So she doesn't want a big army of bumblebees to contend with. So she needs to emerge a bit later, but not too late that there are big bumblebee nests already established. So the red-tailed bumblebee in particular is quite a menacing looking bee. You wouldn't want to mess with her. But if you look at the top right image there, those are the males of the same species, and they are extremely cute and fluffy, and they are very docile. But really fascinating to see cuckoo bumblebees in my local park and garden. And yeah, the red-tailed cuckoo bee is considered a scarcer bee in the region, but recent records are showing that it is more widespread than we previously thought. Later in summer, we also have what are called the Plaster Bees. So these are little gingery stripy bees that particularly like daisy type plants. So if you have yarrow, oxeye daisies, any sort of plant from the daisy family, you'll likely find these little bees on them. And they are called plaster bees because, like the yellow-faced bees, they secrete a cellophane-like material to waterproof their nests. They can be confused with honeybees because they look quite similar, but they collect their pollen very differently on their legs, and they also have these little heart-shaped faces. A really lovely bee, and they tend to nest in light sandy soils. So if you do have any daisy type plants, make sure to look out for them next year. When you get to July, August time, you'll start to see quite a number of male bumblebees, and that's because many bumblebee nests are coming towards their end. And when they are coming towards the end, the queen will start to produce males and new queens. And another tip to look out for when trying to decide if your bumblebee is a female or a male, a number of species have this yellow facial hair that you can just about see on the red-tailed bumblebee male, and I often say that it looks like a mustache, and there's a few species that have this, so that's a good ID tip to look out for. And the sole purpose of the male bumblebees is to find a new queen to mate with. So once they leave the nest, they're not allowed back in, and as a result they've got longer hair in order to keep warm, and you often find them sort of on flowers, sometimes looking quite fed up because of being exposed to colder weather or the rain, and they're quite often happy to sit on your fingers or hands to warm up. And you can see that they all look quite different depending on the species. Early bumblebee males, you can see them as early as May-June because the nest life cycle ends earlier than other species. But you can find the males right through until October time, still hanging on to the milder weather. So once you reach September, October time, most wildflowers are done and dusted for the year. But ivy starts to come into flower, and it's a fantastic plant for many late flying pollinators, not just bees, but also wasps, hoverflies, butterflies. So you will see new queen bumblebees on ivy, as well as any workers that are still hanging on, and male bumblebees as well. But ivy is overall just a fantastic late season resource for those late flying pollinators. And if you have any ivy nearby, I've got quite a lot in my local cemetery and park. On a sunny day in September, October time, do have a look at your ivy patches, because you'll be amazed by how many insects are using this ivy and the diversity of insects using the ivy. And due to the changing climate and the availability of winter garden plants, you may also find some winter active bumblebees, namely the buff-tailed bumblebee. So this was observed back in the 1990s. Instead of queens going into hibernation over winter, they instead set up a winter active nest. And this is believed to be due to the combination of milder winters, but also the availability of garden plants during winter in urban areas such as Mahonia or winter heathers. And this is a behaviour that you are more likely to see down south. But in December last year, I observed this worker buff-tailed bumblebee back in December, and she was collecting pollen, which is a sign of an active nest. So that was really interesting to see, and it's possibly a behaviour we're more likely to see in the coming years. So if you do have Mahonia or any other winter flowering garden plants, do look out for winter active bumblebees from sort of November through to January, because you might just find some. So thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed a sort of virtual tour of gates of bees throughout the year, and I hope it inspires you to go out and look for bees in your local area next year, because you never know what you might find and there's always new discoveries to be made. Thank you for listening.